What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're gonna hear Frank Turek claim that murdering innocent men, women, children, and babies is gracious. I cannot believe how Frank Turek ends up arguing for genocide and the senseless slaughter of innocent people as a good thing. But he manages. If you want to fuck around and be completely disgusted by Frank Turek's argument, then please stay tuned.
Why is there so much death and violence initiated by God in the Old Testament?
He was drunk at the time? Seriously though, violence is one method of control. Do what God wants or else he'll fuck you up. Also, God seemed to reflect the civilizations that they were conceived in. So it kind of makes sense that these ancient Israelites, being bloodthirsty savages, would also create a God that is also a bloodthirsty savage. This is evident from the religion and the content of the Old Testament. They did not value all life. What they valued the most was worshiping their God in their way, and more specifically, only their God.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. A lot of people think that the God of the Old Testament is different from the God of the New Testament because there seems to be much more judgment in the Old Testament. I think one of the things we forget, if you look at the Old Testament covers thousands of years of history. The New Testament covers about 62. There's a lot of time to mess up in thousands of years, right? Not a lot of time to mess up in 62.
You know, I really don't understand how the length of time that this magical book takes place over really factors into how hideously God treats humans in general. God directly calls for his chosen people to senselessly murder young children and babies. God has the Israelites take young virgin girls as sexual slaves. He even has the Israelites selling women to men. Like, their own Israelite women get sold off to other men without any kind of consideration for the consent of the woman, because that didn't exist at the time. The Israelites engaged in raping women either through forced marriages or other means. Some of these acts are judgment by God, mainly murdering innocent lives. In most instances, God is only judging these people for being born to the wrong group. Of course, during the flood, the wrong group was just humanity in general, with the exception of one family, who eventually fucked each other into populating the world, according to the Bible. But the important thing to grasp about the majority of God's judgments in the Old Testament is that he's not judging them for being immoral. It was judgment for simply not believing in Yahweh, or at least not only worshiping him, or not worshiping him in the way that he wants. You know, all of those diamond encrusted dildos he has them make. And none of these things are dependent on how long of a time frame the Old Testament takes place over. These are all shitty actions of a shitty fictional being.
Although, and why I say 62, because generally it goes from Jesus's birth to 62 AD, because I think that's the time that Luke completes the book of Acts, no later than 62 AD. So, of course, Revelation is later, it seems later, but with regard to history, what it's covering from Jesus's birth to about 62 AD.
This is as convincing as blaming all of the evil and sin that exists in the world on a woman eating a fruit salad. Acts is first historical fiction, and second most likely written after 93 CE. We know this because of the various points where Acts matches up with Josephus's work, like mentions of the census under Quirinius, the 3 failed rebel leaders, and several more points of connection, as you can see in this image. Dennis MacDonald has also done great work in showing the connections between Luke Acts and Homer's epics like the Iliad and Odyssey. MacDonald's conclusion is parsimonious with how we know people were taught how to write in Greek. They would have had to have attended these pagan schools, and within these pagan schools, they taught people how to write stories in Greek by having them copy and change these epics like Homer's epics or other Greek texts. They basically told them to copy it and change it just enough so that people can't tell that you're copying it. This was a well-known practice in the 1st century CE. We also know that Luke Acts relies heavily on both the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. Mark, being most likely written between 65 and 70 CE, means that Luke definitely couldn't have been written in 62 CE. Of course, Frank thinks that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts about Jesus, but he has to assume that conclusion instead of making any kind of coherent argument for it. Frank seems to only adhere to a fundamentalist view of the Gospel narratives, which makes sense due to the fact that he is a young earth creationist. He's the one that coined that grading phrase of from the goo to the zoo to you or some kind of shit like that. But all of this is tangential to the topic of this video, so I don't really want to dive too deep into Frank Turek's fuckery on this idea.
And the Old Testament does have judgment, but the New Testament has judgment as well, because Jesus says to Caiaphas when he's on trial, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming with power on the clouds," which is a reference to judgment coming on Jerusalem. And he said this to Caiaphas. When did he say that? He said that in about 30 AD or 33 AD, and that happened in 70 AD. So that was during the lifetime of Caiaphas that there was judgment that was brought down on Israel, and it was judgment that Jesus predicted.
Well, this is an instance of God's judgment in the New Testament. This is not the kind of suffering that we're talking about in the Old Testament. What we're talking about are heinous acts either commanded or carried out by God himself. Regardless of whether or not these people deserve judgment, God commands innocent people be slaughtered and women to be raped. If that is just judgment, then I want to morally be as far away from that shit as possible. Let me ask you guys something. What would it take for you to justify selling a woman into sexual slavery? Just consider that for a moment. What would it take for you to command that another person take the life of a child? If you have no answer to these questions because you would never have that happen to anyone, then you are better than Yahweh. And if Jesus is Yahweh or God, then you are a much better person than Jesus ever was.
Jesus also talks a lot more about hell in the New Testament than the Old Testament talks about it. So there's much judgment in the New Testament as well.
Well, hell was one of those concepts that was syncretized with Judaism. A burning hellfire type of hell comes from Zoroastrianism. And also the concept of a devil, or this cosmic antithesis of the savior deity. And you know, this whole idea of a burning eternal hellfire is something that made sense back then when they, incorporated it into Judaism, but now it just doesn't make any kind of fucking sense to me at all. I mean, why would you condemn somebody to eternal damnation for finite crimes? And these aren't even crimes like what we're talking about in Christianity, at least, because as we'll probably discuss later, sins are just transgressing God's opinion. That's it. The whole concept of hell is just simply ridiculous and overkill. But again, this is not what we're talking about in this video. And this is the second time he's brought up something tangentially related to the topic. I do agree that if Jesus is God, then he's the same son of a bitch from the Old Testament. That same God, Jesus, had Jacob work to purchase 2 women that he wanted to buy. Oh, and their servant girls, who later became Jacob's concubines, who were subsequently forced to carry Jacob's children against their consent, or well, rather their consent just simply didn't exist because it wasn't considered at all. That's the kind of suffering that we're talking about in this video and what the question is generally referring to. I feel like Frank Turek knows that the Old Testament is full of shit, and that his God is a shithead, but he's doing his best to try to sugarcoat this situation.
Now, we could go into specifics of Old Testament judgment if you want to talk about the Canaanites or those kinds, or Noah even. Sure. But those are judgments based on the idea that people have sinned. And it's up to God when God judges people. Look, if Christianity's true, people don't die, they just change location. They go from this life to the next life, and it's up to God when that happens. God is not arbitrary in the Old Testament.
Well, is God arbitrary? The God of the Old Testament sure does seem arbitrary. I feel like narcissistically laying down a bunch of rules for people to follow, obey, and worship you so that you can be happy is pretty fucking arbitrary. And then, of course, God gets pissed off and goes into a drunken rage whenever people don't make him happy. Now, that's not to say that some of these rules can't have good reasons behind them, and perhaps those were the real driving factors for making these rules. But as far as what the Old Testament says, or the reasons that the Old Testament gives for laying down these rules, it's really just arbitrary. Essentially, sin is just transgressing God's opinion. Frank Turek and other apologists like him think that God's opinion is the most supreme opinion and should be revered amongst all other opinions. But then again, that also would be arbitrary as fuck.
So let's take the Canaanites, for example. Why does God kill the Canaanites? He gives them over 400 years of warnings to move out of the land and stop their detestable practices. But their practices kept getting worse and worse and worse, to the point where they were literally sacrificing their children on the molten hot idol known as Molech. Even Solomon did this, by the way, that they would put their babies on the arms of this idol and watch their babies sizzle to death.
First of all, Frank acts like ancient Israelites were not also practicing baby sacrifice. There were some Israelites that were sacrificing their children for Yahweh. Heath D. Durrell points out the number of times in the Old Testament where child sacrifice is mentioned positively and is even practiced. While the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, Genesis 22, is probably the most famous example, there are also less well-known tales, such as Jephthah's sacrifice of his daughter in fulfillment of a vow, Judges 11 through 12, and King Mesha of Moab's sacrifice of his firstborn son during what appeared to be a hopeless siege, 2 Kings 3. Various biblical law codes demand that the firstborn of one's cattle and flocks be handed over as a sacrifice to Yahweh, but some passages suggest that the requirement applied to firstborn children as well. In most cases, firstborn children are to be, quote, redeemed, end quote, via the offering of a sheep, example Exodus 34:19-20, or a cash payment to the priest, example Numbers 18:15-16. But in at least one case, no form of redemption is mentioned, Exodus 22:28-29. Possibly indicating that firstborn children were sacrificed in some Yahwistic circles. Child sacrifice in ancient Israel, Heath D. Durrell. Jephthah's daughter sizzled either to death or was cooked post-mortem. Exodus also has God specifically killing young children in the final plague to Egypt. That's God killing children and babies in order to accomplish something that he could have easily accomplished without the need for the senseless slaughter of innocent children. Now, you could say, oh, well, the Pharaoh refused to let him go and blah, 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 blah. But then you have to explain how God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that basically Pharaoh pushed God into the position where he's like, ooh, now I get to kill the children. Like some evil comic book fucking villain. So I think that you can see plainly that God simply doesn't care about the senseless murdering of young children. The only thing that this God cares about is whether or not children are murdered for him, because then it's okay. The only thing that Yahweh was judging the Canaanites for was for not sacrificing and murdering children for him. That was the detestable thing they were doing. They just weren't worshiping him. Don't let apologists like Frank Turek try to convince you that God has a problem with the senseless slaughter of innocent children. He's obviously fine with it and has even practiced it on occasion.
In fact, Plutarch, who's a Greek writer, not a biblical writer, he's writing about in the first century, and he even talks about this, and he said that the drummers around this sacrifice would play their drums more loudly so the parents couldn't hear the screams of their own children.
Frank is basically correct about Plutarch here. This comes from Plutarch's On Superstition text, and he doesn't specifically say parents, he just says in general people, so I'll let that slide. But still, Yahweh doesn't have a problem with baby sacrifice or the immorality of the action. And like we mentioned before, the Israelites had no issue with sacrificing children as long as it was done for Yahweh. Going back to one of our examples, Jephthah had promised God that he would sacrifice the first thing to run out of his house to greet him if God were to help him defeat whoever in the fuck they hated that day. God, being the omniscient fuck that he is, knew exactly what was going to happen and still made that particular pinky swear. He knew that Jephthah was going to have to sacrifice his daughter, a young child. The author of this text even had the daughter encourage Jephthah to sacrifice her. Of course, they framed it as keeping the promise to God, which just goes to show that there's no issue when it comes to child sacrifice as long as it is to appease God. Their God specifically, not just any God. So God obviously has no issue with immorality of child sacrifice. The only thing that God seems to care about is whether or not you obey and worship him. And what's considered immoral is to transgress his holy opinion. And that has nothing to do with the moral nature of whatever fucking action you want to consider.
On every college campus I go to, there is some atheist will stand up and say, if there is a good God, why doesn't he stop all the evil in the world? Well, here's a situation in the Old Testament where God says, that's it, we got to stop this. And the atheists are complaining about it.
Look at here, shit for brains. We're complaining because God isn't stopping the child sacrifices. If God was stopping the child sacrifice as if to sort of save the children, then why would he specifically tell the Israelites to go ahead and kill all of the children, along with the non-virgin women? And it's a really fucked up solution to stop child sacrifice by just going ahead and killing all of the children. Well, if we go ahead and we kill all these kids, then I guess they got nobody left to sacrifice, so this is really for the best. It baffles me that Turek is actually trying to paint God as like saving these children, while at the same time calling for the slaughter of their entire people, but also the children. And if you want to sit there and be like, no, God didn't tell the Israelites to kill the kids. I mean, that's just not in the Bible. Why don't you read the Bible, fucking Godless Engineer, you dumb fuck? Well, I have to say, God is very specific about who he wants the Israelites to kill, and that's everybody.
They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it. Men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys.
So, God wanted them all dead. Not just the war-fighting men, but every living thing. He also did the same thing to the Midianites, simply for mixing with the Israelite population.
Now, kill all the boys, and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Numbers 31, 17 to 18.
Oh, and if you want to be like, well, that's just the Canaanites and the Midianites. So, like everybody else, like he was fine. Like he didn't call for the slaughter of like every fucking person in the group. It's not what God did he? Where's my Bible? Oh, no. In fact, God has specifically stated that this kind of savagery should extend to all of the people groups that God didn't like. And he made sure to list off all of them.
However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Pezerites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 20:16-18.
Do not leave alive anything that breathes. I don't know how much louder I can state that. That is what God said. God didn't say, go in there, save all the babies and the childrens. I mean, I love those little guys so much. He said, kill them fuckers too.
Fuck them kids.
Because simply God doesn't care about killing children in any group.
So God says it's time to judge this nation, these people, and he does. So it's judgment. It's not arbitrary. He doesn't wake up like some sort of mob boss one morning and say, Canaanites, I want them dead. No, that's not the way it works. He is gracious and he is long-suffering, and he knew to get the promised people in the promised land to bring forth the promised Messiah, at some point he's going to have Israel move those people out of the land, and that's exactly what happened.
It's hard to take a person seriously that says that God was gracious in calling for the slaughter of innocent men, women, and children, especially when God specifically lists out all of the individuals that are supposed to be put to death, which was every fucking body. Well, in the case of the Midianites, they were supposed to save all the virgin girls, so yeah, that is an instance of sexual slavery, because those girls would have been forced into marriages to Israelite men. Forced marriages are a form of rape. Also, despite what a lot of Christians think out there, marital rape is a real thing. Stop being dipshits about it. But anyways, back to the extermination of innocent lives. That's not gracious, and I can't believe that I'm actually having to say those words, that extermination of anybody is not gracious. Or maybe I just have a different definition of what gracious is. Considering that gracious means courteous, kind, and pleasant, I failed to see how the slaughter of innocent people, let alone young children and babies, can be considered gracious. How fucked in the head do you have to be to call that action gracious, or a sign of grace? And every single apologist makes this argument too. We've seen J. Warner Wallace make this argument, as well as William Lane Craig. And my guess is that they have to make this kind of shitty argument in order to maintain that God is omnibenevolent and the arbiter of morality. But as we've seen in this video, God does not care about the moral actions that people commit. He only cares about whether or not you believe in him. That's it. That's all. I can never see myself ever worshiping that kind of God. I mean, if that God exists, I'll acknowledge that he exists, but I will never worship such a fucking shitty, hateful, bloodthirsty God. Probably because I'm better than Jesus and Yahweh. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you thought about Frank Turek's video. Do you think that he's just being obstinate or obtuse about this particular topic in Christianity? Do you think he's bullshitting his audience, or do you think that he actually believes the shit that he says? Let me know down below in the comments, and while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.